Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. So welcome, everyone, to this Citizen Science Showcase event. My name's Loz, and I'm here from the Natural History Consortium, who have organised the showcase. This showcase is a whole programme of events taking place this week that's helping to connect hundreds of people to citizen science, which is where everyday people can get involved in collecting or analysing data, mostly that helps us to understand our natural world a bit better. The showcase is part of the Citizen Science Local Pilot, which is a project, wider project here across Somerset, Wiltshire, Dorset, and the west of England that's helping to make improvements in citizen science, and it's supported by Natural England and funded by the government's Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme. So just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded, but we do encourage you to ask questions, put them in the chat, and then we will, if we have time, we'll at the end, we'd love to answer some of those questions. I say we, I mean Rachel will. So I will now hand over to Rachel Murphy to tell us a little bit more about the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. Thank you, and over to you, Rachel.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lars. Yes, well, I'll do my best to answer the questions as we go. Brilliant. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. Lars, do let me know if there's any problems at all seeing my slides or if they're not moving over. I'm going to guess that you can see that first initial slide now, but if I see you sort of wave frantically, I'll know that there's something going wrong. Otherwise, I'll just crack on. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening, and especially, of course, I'm going to say welcome to anybody who is new to the National Plant Monitoring Scheme or interested in becoming a volunteer with us. So as Loz has said, I'm Rachel Murphy. I'm the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, so I'm based with Plant Life. And I'm really looking forward to sharing all about the NPMS with you today. That is what I'm going to be calling it from now on, the NPMS, because otherwise it's a very long-winded name to say National Plant Monitoring Scheme every 2 minutes. So just a final little bit of housekeeping. While we're not able to see you or hear you, just to make you aware, as Laura said, of course, you can pop anything in the chat or in the Q&A. Although just to make you aware that anything that you do put in there, we can see the name, obviously, that you've registered with. And hopefully we'll get to those as we go. If you're happy to, do feel free to say hi in the chat box. What sort of area you're joining us from? Maybe let us know if you're a newly registered volunteer, perhaps with NPMS. Maybe you saw the advert and thought, I'll have a little look in advance, or perhaps let us know if you've joined us this evening to find out a little bit more, and hopefully we'll have a chance to inspire you to become part of our volunteer community. So yes, I'm Rachel Murphy. I actually am not a botanist by training. That's something I always say first and foremost, just really to give an idea of how accessible, how inclusive the NPMS really is. Of course, I have been working for Plant Life now for, about 6 years. So I have certainly learned a lot along the way, but actually, my bag is really thinking about citizen science. I'm a huge advocate of citizen science and the incredible impact and value of volunteer captured data in helping us to monitor, of course, our precious landscapes. And I've been managing schemes with citizen science, national schemes, citizen science schemes now for, golly, 10, 15 years. I don't know. I've lost count. So that's really my background. Citizen science, survey methodology, standardization, and really making the most of this incredible data that people out on the ground can capture. So just to give a little bit of an outline of what we're hoping to cover today, I'm hoping to give you a bit of background about what the NPMS actually is and why it was started, and how the data is being used. And then hopefully, if we inspire you, as I say, a little bit about how you can become a volunteer with us, how you can get started. And then it would be good to just let you know about some of the support and the help that you could get as a volunteer with the scheme. Hopefully help you engage with plants and biological monitoring in your area. So the NPMS, as the name suggests, it's a national scheme, so it's UK-wide. It is a citizen science habitat-based plant monitoring scheme, and that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. The scheme was set up to provide an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance all across UK habitats and through time, and really ultimately to help us to gain a better understanding of habitat health. And it was really designed to meet the need for a standardised approach to plant monitoring, was really identified as a really high priority within the terrestrial biodiversity surveillance strategy that was published way back when, I think in about 2008 by the JNCC. And a real sort of whistle-stop basis of the NPMS is that all across the UK, monads, or simply put, 1 kilometre squares, have been randomly designated all over the country, and volunteers up and down can allocate themselves one or more of these 1 kilometre squares to survey twice a year. Now, the NPMS was designed and developed by the BSBI, I should say the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and Plant Life. So the JNCC is the public body that advises the UK government and the devolved administrations on UK-wide and international nature conservation. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology is an independent, not-for-profit research institute, and they carry out environmental science across land, sea and air. So they are the folk working really hard to crunch those numbers and analyse our data. The BSBI is a botanical society for anyone interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland. You may well already be aware, and you may have even heard or seen of the publication of the BSBI's latest plant atlas last year, which is an absolutely excellent resource all about botanical species in the UK and their distribution and how they're faring. In more recent years, actually, we've also been supported by Defra over in Northern Ireland with the scheme's expansion to Northern Ireland. Within Plant Life, we're very much involved in the volunteer support, volunteer recruitment, volunteer training, really the supportive arm of the NPMS. And along with these partners, the scheme was co-developed with volunteers actually on the ground during a really inclusive trial phase with contributors and volunteers from a real variety of backgrounds and experiences, because it was and it really still is so important that the scheme is accessible and inclusive to all, but while also maintaining that sort of robust and standardized methodology and data standards. So as I say, so we can make the most of that incredible data. So as I've said, the NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance through time. And we all quite aware of, or we will have heard of, in the UK, long-standing schemes for monitoring populations of bats, birds, butterflies, for example, the British Bird Survey and the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But actually, until the NPMS began, there wasn't a similar scheme for plants. So with major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, whether through, for example, habitat management change, perhaps nutrient enrichment, climate change, and so on, it really became crucial to have a better understanding of our plant populations. At the end of the day, they are the foundation of our habitats and our ecosystems. So there was, and as I say, still is, a need for a large-scale coverage and a really systematic approach, because otherwise there's a potential to miss trends and patterns in the data. And this is, I would argue, only really achievable through citizen science with the help of a large number of dedicated volunteers. So the 4 original partners I've mentioned came together in 2012 to devise the scheme and the methodologies before a pilot was then run in 2014. And in 2015, the NPMS was launched. So that made last season, 2024, the 10th year the scheme has run and data's been collected. So the grand scheme of things, we're a relatively young scheme really, but actually the last couple of years have been pivotal for the scheme because we now have enough data to start looking at trends and indicators, which of course can be a challenge of long-term monitoring schemes. You know, we need that time before we can start uncovering these changes and trends. But happily now, and hopefully as I'll demonstrate as we carry on talking, we're heading into our 11th season already and providing really useful information already. So the objectives for the scheme continue to be to provide data on indicator plant species and habitat quality and how they're changing over time, to produce national indicators of plant quality, to engage volunteer naturalists with plant communities and habitats at smaller scales, and to support our recorders through their engagement with the scheme and the species that they monitor, including through providing resources and training for those volunteers. The scheme also allows us to investigate drivers of the change that perhaps we're observing. Considering, for example, climate change, habitat management, invasive species, pollution, coastal management, all of these things that are popping up onto the screen now, and likely many more. So just to give me a bit of a breather really, and to put some nice pretty pictures on the screen, I just wanted to show a real whistle-stop tour of what's involved in such a large-scale scheme and provide you with the recipe for the NPMS. So I've mentioned 5 partners. We currently have over 1,500 volunteers taking part and registered across the country, and they record at 3 different recording levels, which I will go into very shortly. And we ask our volunteers to visit their sites twice a year to conduct their surveys. We don't ask our volunteers to survey an entire 1 kilometre square, because I think by the time you'd finished for one season, you'd be getting started again. So our volunteers actually just survey around 5 smaller plots within that 1 kilometre square. We're really interested in 11 broad habitat types, and within those nested, they're made up of 28 fine habitats. And there are 408 NPMS species that we are particularly interested in. So we call these our indicator species. And essentially, they have been chosen as species that are very good indicators of habitat health. But I should also say that there's a bit of a combination here of them being good species to indicate habitat health, but also species that are quite widely distributed and easily identified. So again, we don't necessarily ask our volunteers to record all vascular plants they might see in a grassland, for example, or within their plots, but from a list of indicator species. So, as I've mentioned, a really great aspect of the NPMS is that each volunteer, prior to heading out and conducting their surveys, they decide which level they wish to survey at. Of course, all depending on their confidence, their experience, how comfortable they feel identifying the species within the habitats they have in their square. So we have our wildflower level, or our beginner level. And that really involves lists of around 10 or 15 species per habitat type. And these are sort of more easily identifiable species. We then have our indicator level, sort of an intermediate level, and that's an expanded list of species. So for each habitat, rather than looking for just say the 15 species, we'd be looking for around 30 species per habitat type. And then, yes, we do have the inventory level, which is our sort of our expert level, which is for all vascular plant species. So it really depends on, as I say, your confidence and your experience. You can decide which level you choose to survey at, but otherwise the methodology is exactly the same. So, for example, I'm going to think about a dry deciduous woodland. If you are monitoring at the wildflower level, there's around 15 to 20 species that need to be identified, including things like ivy, holly, your cleavers, hazel, for example. Whereas at the indicator level, there is an expanded list of species to record, so up to 30 species in deciduous woodland. Things like the additions of wood sedge, for example, wood speedwell, so slightly trickier species. And then, as I say, at the inventory level, those more expert volunteers do record all vascular plants. So there really is something for everyone. Being able to monitor the UK's habitat plots in this way each year really provides an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the responses of plants to our changing environment. So from extreme weather events like droughts in the summer, we noticed in the drought in the summer of 2018, NPMS data indicated increases in bare ground and an increase in the abundance of species that are better at tolerating these stresses during that season. Also, certain orchid species are being recorded by our volunteers in ever more northerly locations. Also, we can think about trying to think now, increasing fertility of many UK habitats. Monitoring key indicator species is really providing evidence already of the effects of eutrophication and its impact on species that are intolerant to nitrogen, for example. And we're already seeing differences in habitats for these key indicators over time. And also the impacts of non-native species. So the NPMS is the only citizen science project that actually allows us to see how the most invasive species are interacting with native plant biodiversity across the UK. And in 2023, NPMS researchers published a paper on climate exposure analysis. So it reported that warming temperatures have really seen wild plant species such as bee orchid and pyramidal orchid expand their ranges. Some rare Arctic alpine plants, such as Norwegian mugwort, trying to think mountain sandwort, are also likely to be at risk of going extinct in Britain as our uplands become more temperate. The study suggested that human-driven climate change is likely to fall hardest on arable and horticultural land, also calcareous grasslands, so grasslands with high pH, and also urban areas. And according to the findings, our calcareous grasslands are actually the most exposed semi-natural habitat to the effects of climate change. And the paper really showed that climate changes are affecting the UK unevenly. The paper states that regionally it falls more in southern, central and eastern England, and locally it's greater at higher elevation locations than nearby areas at lower elevations. So this NPMS data is really contributing to a lot of studies. At the moment, it is publicly available, and species records also go to the National Biodiversity Network, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, so BSBI for the Plant Atlas, and it is global data, and indeed more than 300 studies to date have integrated our citizen science observations. So that's a huge amount of contribution to research going on worldwide, just in the 10 years that we have been operating. A really major achievement for the NPMS is the experimental indicator. So Defra and JNCC publish UK biodiversity indicators, which provide an annual view of how a variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have basically fared across the UK in recent years. And 2020 was really a landmark year for NPMS volunteers because it marked the first ever contribution of NPMS data to a national biodiversity indicator. And it was the first time the annual habitat indicator has been contributed through volunteer effort. So specifically NPMS data for 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats that you can see here on this slide. So data from these habitats were used to create a new indicator called category C7, which is plants of the wider countryside. And more recently, at the end of last year, an update to these indicators were published again, with NPMS data providing the data for this category in the national indicator. It's still classified as an experimental indicator and work on this is ongoing, but getting to this point in only 5 and then 10 years of field surveys really highlights the incredible dedication of our volunteers in really getting out into the countryside, establishing and surveying their plots in order to help us understand the changes of our environment. As I say, this large-scale and systematic approach really is only made possible through the dedication of our volunteers. And should you be interested, we've recently launched a new page on the NPMS website called Indicator Species Trend, and that showcases current trends from NPMS volunteer data. It allows you to view current annual abundance estimates for any of the positive or negative indicator species that we monitor within NPMS habitats, and it's also linked to the BSBI Plant Atlas website, so it provides photographs of all those species as well. So do take a look at that following the talk this evening, and these are very recently, actually in the last month, been updated with the 2023 data, and now analysis is starting for the 2024 data. So yeah, the page is publicly available. You don't need to be a registered volunteer to take a look. Do go and have a look at that if you get a chance. And you can find out more about this and loads of all the other work that's going on through the NPMS team in our annual reports on our website, along with volunteer newsletters and news pieces. So do go and take a look at the various things that we are getting up to. So how are we doing so far? As you can see on the map here, you can see all of the NPMS squares across the country, and they are either orange, which means they have been allocated to a volunteer, or they are blue, which means they're still currently available. At the moment, we have about 1,500 volunteers, just above, allocated to a square, and some volunteers take on more than one square, actually. So to date, we've got well over 1,000 squares nationwide, where data has been returned for at least 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and some all the way up. I think it's around 50 of our squares have more than 10 years worth of data. So nationally, we've got an absolutely excellent community of volunteers, and they've amassed data from over 8,000 surveys by the end of last season. And that's not even including the figures from 2024. We tend to analyse those over the winter months. You may have already seen a map similar to this on the right if you've had a little look at the NPMS website beforehand. But if not, do go and take a look to see if there is a square near you. There's plenty waiting for volunteers to take them on. So I thought it would be worthwhile just taking a closer look across Wessex. So I've just roughly zoomed in on my map here to our area of interest. And again, you can see there are plenty of squares looking to be adopted across the southwest. Some have never before been surveyed, so they're completely new squares in terms of we don't have any previous data for them, whereas some of them have perhaps already previously been surveyed, but they are currently without an allocated volunteer. So do take a look. If you head to the Squares Near Me page, you don't even need to be registered to do this. You can just pop in your postcode, a distance that you're willing to travel, and see if there are any squares near you. If you are interested in taking part, do have a look, as I say, at this squares map, and you can actually have a close look. There's a few different little features on the map you might be able to see in the top right-hand corner there that really helps you to find your bearings or even get some initial information about the land that it falls on. So, for example, you can opt to add different layers, for example, triple SIs, and if there are any squares that overlap with triple SIs, any that overlap with national parks, for example, any AOMBs, even national trust boundaries. We work very closely with the National Trust to ensure that all squares that overlap with National Trust land are taken up and surveyed. So do take a look at that. It is worth mentioning as well at this point, actually, that if you have gone to take a look at a square, only to find that those near you are all orange, meaning that they're already allocated, please don't be too disheartened. Squares are quite regularly quite frequently actually released either by volunteers leaving the scheme or moving geographically, perhaps opting to take on another square for a bit of a change. Or even sometimes volunteers are absolutely thrilled by the idea of sharing a square and they're quite keen to buddy up. So if you do find that there's a square that you're particularly interested in, but it appears to be allocated, do get in touch because we are more than happy to help with options. On this map, there's also often there's also an option to select a square of interest. You might be able to see the one that's red there and highlighted, and you can take a little bit of a closer look at that particular square's survey history to find out if it has previously been surveyed, how many times, what sort of species have been recorded on there. So in this example here, it looks like, yep, this square is currently available. But we can see that actually it does already have plots created on it. It has previously been surveyed just the once, 2019, but we can see a list of squares that have already been recorded within those plots. And that person actually conducted an inventory survey, so it's a pretty good baseline survey. So that would be absolutely fantastic for somebody to take up and continue monitoring that site for any change. So do take a good look at that map if you're interested at all. So to revisit, the aim of the scheme is to provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within semi-natural habitats, and to use both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. And they are included in the scheme. Basically, they were chosen to be both reliable indicators of habitat health but also species that are widespread and relatively easy to identify. The survey design was devised to be straightforward, repeatable, and achievable by volunteers and just a wide group of participants. So to look more into the basics, once a surveyor has allocated themselves a randomly designated 1 kilometre square, they establish their plots if they have not yet already been established. Ideally, these represent different habitat types. And then the surveyors record the abundance of these indicator species and any other plot characteristics twice a year. And that's once in late spring or early summer, and then again in later summer. We're not more prescriptive on timing because, of course, it has to fit around your busy schedules. Just ideally if we have one in early summer and again in late summer. So getting started, if we've managed to sort of inspire you or made you realise that how hugely valuable and important this data is, once a volunteer has visited our website and they have registered with the scheme, so essentially they've signed up with us and they've requested and been allocated a square, they receive a welcome pack, both digitally and in person, which you can see here in the image. And that contains survey guidance notes, so all the information that you need to know regarding methodology, how to get on and conduct the surveys. You also receive a species ID guide, a very lovely species ID guide we can see on the top there, with images, diagrams, descriptions of all of our indicator species that we monitor. You also have species and habitat lists, so the list of each species that we monitor in each habitat type. And then you can just see tucked behind there are survey forms for you to take out into the field. Of course, volunteers also supplement with their own ID books of choice along with our species ID guide, but it's a super helpful, really handy species ID guide that we include in the pack that we send to our volunteers. We always recommend to our volunteers that they do a recce or reconnaissance visit to identify, or just really to get to know their squares, really get to know the square, identify what habitats lie within it, check to see if there are any plots previously set up. If there are, we do ask that our volunteers adopt these plot locations where at all possible, rather than create new plots. We understand this isn't, of course, always possible if land use has changed or ownership or habitats have changed. Is the ideal because, of course, we're interested in change over time. We just suggest that folk initially use footpaths or lanes, use OS maps or phone apps. Google Satellite's absolutely fantastic, just to really start to get to know the square, take your time over it, enjoy getting to know the site that perhaps you wouldn't have otherwise visited. And then whenever you're ready, you can start to survey those plots that you can set up within your square. We recommend, but again, it is not fixed because, of course, it depends on your square. We recommend that volunteers set up 2 or 3 small square plots, so 5 by 5 metre plots. They do become 10 by 10 metre squats if you're setting them up in woodland. Or if you have any linear features, such as waterways, hedgerows, for example, you can set up linear plots, so 1 by 25 metres, so the same overall space. So it's quite a nice manageable size plot. We do say that you need to consider land access, of course, and safety. We wouldn't want anybody going anywhere that they didn't feel safe, and to consider land ownership and permissions and to make sure landowners are happy with your activities. The plots themselves, just to give a brief overview of how survey plots are set up, or even how they're selected. We provide all of our volunteers with maps, OS maps of their square, which also indicate habitats that you are likely to find within that square. Of course, these are estimates. These are made up by composite maps, so they can be a touch, maybe a little bit out of date, but largely, by and large, they're really good indications of what habitat you may have within your square. And we also put within those maps recommended locations for square plots. I'm sure, as you can imagine, if we're all allowed to sort of select the plots that we're really interested in, we'd end up with lots of really beautiful plots in encompassing some gorgeous orchids in the corner of a meadow that perhaps isn't truly representative of the whole area. So we aim for those recommended plots first to try and take away some of that surveyor bias. But if none of those recommended plots are possible, or if only some of them are, then of course our volunteers can set up their plots where it's safe, accessible, they're comfortable to do so, they can identify the habitat type, and it's good representation of the square. Whilst they're on the site, we offer our volunteers lots of tips as to how to lay out their plots, their square plots, how to record the location of those plots, number of means, photographs, GPS coordinates, sketches even, all to really help make sure that we are finding the same location or as close as possible in subsequent years. We mark out the perimeter of our 5x5 meter plots, for example, and then we can get down to surveying the abundance of the indicator species. So it really is a simple survey pack that's needed, a backpack, with your tape measure and your string or your gardening twine, a clipboard or weather writer, and your flags or markers, whatever you can use to mark out the corners of your plots. Golly, through the last 6 years, I've seen all sorts. I've seen knitting needles, apparently, are very, very good to get into soil. I've seen folk using tent pegs, all sorts. So it's quite a simple, as I say, field pack that you need to take out with you. There are additional things that you may choose, other equipment that can really help with surveys. For example, of course, you need to take your survey guidance notes and species lists, and your map and your clipboard and pencils. Some folk take hand lenses and compasses to help them both with, finding out where their plots are and then actually identifying the species. I've mentioned taking your own ID guides. Some people take their own GPS device. We would never expect people to purchase or have their own GPS device. I don't even have one. I use a handy OS app on my phone. So we certainly don't expect anybody to go out and pay, a decent amount of money on expensive kit. We do recommend, of course, a phone for safety, but also to take photographs or a camera. And of course, consider your health and safety, perhaps a field kit, and making sure that you have the correct clothing and whatnot. So that's to set up our square plots. I thought it was worth me just popping in some examples of where people do set up their linear plots or 1x25 meter plots. So I've mentioned along waterways, standing waters, rivers, streams, ponds or canals, also along rocky outcrops, cliffs, cliff bases or screes, arable field margins, hedgerows and road verges. So of course, a number of our squares will have a certain number of linear features that we will have linear plots along. So these are just 1 meter by 25 meters, but set up in a very similar way, but with some specific instructions depending on the habitat type. So I thought it was worth just mentioning the NPMS habitats that we're particularly interested in. You can see a long list here. We have the broad categories, the 11 broad categories along the left-hand side there. So we have our arable field margins, we have bog and wet heath, which comprise either blanket bog, raised bog, or wet heath. We have broadleaf woodlands, so either dry deciduous woodland, hedgerows of native species, or wet woodland. We are interested in coast habitats, particularly coastal salt marsh, coastal sand dunes, coastal vegetated shingle, maquis, maritime cliff tops and slopes. Also freshwater habitats, whether nutrient poor or nutrient rich, lakes and ponds or rivers and streams. We're interested in heathland habitats, dry heath and dry montane heathland, lowland grassland, so dry acidic grassland, dry calcareous grassland, neutral damp grasslands, neutral pastures and meadows, marsh and fen, upland grasslands. You can see they all have finer habitats nestled within native pinewood and juniper scrub, and lastly, rock outcrops, cliffs and screes. It's no wonder that our four more commonly surveyed habitats are our broadleaf woodland, our lowland grasslands, for example, our arable field margins, those habitats that we tend to see more regularly. So I thought it would just be useful to sort of describe how we know what species we are surveying within those different habitats. So I've just provided a bit of an example here of our species list booklet, which we have both digitally and in print form. Essentially, when you are on your plot, and the example here, say we have a neutral pastures and meadow plot that we are about to survey, people monitoring this or surveying this at the wildflower level, so at the beginner level, will just be recording the abundance of those species highlighted with that flower, that wildflower symbol. So I think there are around 15 or so species that they'll be recording the habitat, the abundance of. If they see anything else, that's lovely, but they don't necessarily record it. If they're recording at the indicator species level, then they'll be recording the abundance of all of those species on that list. Of course, not all of them will be present, but they're the species that they will be looking for and recording. The plus or minus within that indicator column just denotes whether they are positive indicators of habitat health or a negative indicator of habitat health. And you can see in the last column, we very handily have the page number that species can be found in our species ID guide, our lovely species ID guide. And then lastly, of course, if people are conducting the inventory level, then they can indeed throw the species list out the window because they're recording absolutely everything. What I would say is it's not fixed. So if a volunteer starts at the wildflower level and they start to get more confident, they start to get more experience, perhaps they've attended more training with us and they think, I'm going to survey at the indicator level next year. That's absolutely brilliant. We do see an awful lot. We see people moving up again as they gain in confidence and experience, and they move up a level. That's always fantastic to see. So when our volunteers are out in the field, they've got the option to fill in our handy recording forms. So there's just one recording form per plot, and that's used for both visits, both visit 1 and visit 2. And they then head home and enter the data onto the NPMS website, which basically replicates those recording forms you're copying like for like, essentially. There is also the option of using an in-field app, which again replicates that online recording form, or that recording form that you can see on the left there. And that just means that you can be entering the data in the field as you go, so you don't need to enter it when you head back home. So there's 2 options, just depending on your preference. And we very recently updated that in-field app. So that's very new at the moment and has recently been tested and is working beautifully, I'm very glad to say. So there's a few different ways that you can record the findings out in the field. I wanted to mention that we do offer a lot of support and training within the NPMS for our volunteers. As I say, we are looking to be inclusive and accessible to all and make sure that folk are learning and folk are enjoying learning about a number of different things, not just botanical ID, but also in fact field skills as well. So we have a large number of folk that engage with us via our NPMS support Facebook group. It's a group for volunteers and mentors, which can discuss what they've been finding, ask for advice. We also have an NPMS YouTube channel where we pop up webinar recordings, guidance videos. We of course have our survey guidance notes and survey pack materials, and we also work with a number of other organisations to produce and provide training resources. We also have online training resources on the NPMS website for introducing each of the different habitat types and the species within. So we've got a whole raft of resources to provide and for our volunteers to use, and you can go and take a look at those without even being signed up as a volunteer. They are accessible publicly. We do have bespoke training for our volunteers as well, of course, though. We have our in-field training opportunities. So we meet up with folk all around the country and provide survey methodology training. So actually getting out into the field and practice setting up our plots, conducting these surveys. We also have habitat and species specific identification training days. There's a couple coming up actually in Wessex, which I'll mention just at the end. And we have more more social volunteer meetups, walks, more supportive events for peer-to-peer peer support as well throughout the year. And all of these events and all of these training sessions are available and free to registered NPMS volunteers. So those in field, but of course, not everybody can get to the events or the dates or the timings. So we do offer a whole host of online training as well, again on survey methodology, even into how to upload your data and navigate the website perhaps, or use the app. But we do also have habitat and species ID specific training online as well. You can see some examples there. We recently had a fantastic webinar by Josh Stiles about coastal vegetated shingle, for example. We've had one recently, how to identify trees in the winter with Neil Talbot. So we do have these fantastic webinars running all throughout the year for our volunteers as well. But it's worth also mentioning, I've said we do provide field skills webinars and online workshops too. So thinking about plant anatomy, how to use botanical keys, for example, which we run for our volunteers. And we also have additional engagement events and transferable skill events such as botanical art, botanical photography, general interest, webinars and workshops, which really helps to contribute towards that community feel, gets our volunteers talking more broadly around the subject, and just enjoy being part of our volunteer community, as I say. You do need to be a registered volunteer to access these particular events and sessions, but these are free to registered NPMS volunteers. So I've mentioned coming up, actually, I've just flagged these two, but do take a look at our events, our training events and webinars pages on our website. We've got these two coming up. One in Horner Woods in North Somerset, identifying trees in the winter and spring. Again, with really experienced botanist Neil Talbot. So we'll be heading out to the beautiful Horner Woods and learning from Neil. And then later in the summer, we're heading over to Wiltshire, and we're going to be having a bit of a fern foray and learning how to identify woodland ferns with Rachel Jones. So they're available to book now. So if you decide to register with us and you'd like to join us on either of those days, they are completely free. So please do register and sign up to join us. It would be lovely to see you there. As I say, there's loads of ways to find support. If you do have a venture onto our website, you'll see the whole raft of resources and guidance and general interest resources that we have on the website. So do take a look at those. We are also on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, all of the usuals. So do come and join the conversation on there as well. And we also have biannual volunteer newsletters, blogs, news pieces. So do join our mailing list, even if you can't see a square at the moment near you, but you just like to be kept up to date with what's going on in the scheme. As I said, we do have our YouTube channel. We've got our training courses, and I've mentioned our newsletters, which we are more and more trying to include more of a volunteer voice, so sharing volunteer stories and images and findings. I just wanted to finish up really by saying that the data really, really helps. I know I've already said it, but that's the bottom line at the end of the day. That's the reason why we're doing this. It helps us to detect national trends in species and species groups. Also allows us to investigate the impact of non-native species, climate sensitive species, how they're faring. It also helps to look at the direct impacts of sort of short-term, very physical events such as severe weather, so flooding, drought, the introduction of pests, and also changes in land management. And actually, the other very important thing about the NPMS is, of course, we're not just monitoring protected sites that generally are monitored to a greater degree. It's also the area outside of those protected and well-managed areas. if you do have any questions at all, you can't quite decide if you want to get involved or not, please do feel free to get in touch with us at support@npms.org.uk. Either myself or my lovely colleague Karen will be more than happy to respond or arrange a phone call, or we quite often will hold Zoom chats or Teams meetings so we can actually look at the map together, have a little bit of think about perhaps what might suit you more, what you might be interested in. So please don't be shy, do get in touch. And yeah, thank you very much. I think that's the amount of time that you wanted me to talk for, Lars. I could talk all evening.
Amazing. Really, really good to find out lots more about it. And we do have some questions that have come in on the chat and on the Q&A, and some people have messaged directly. So I've kind of grouped together similar questions. Some questions that have come up a few times are, for example, if someone's nearest allocated random square is like an hour away, is there the possibility of allowing people to monitor squares more locally to them? Is that a possibility?
So I mean, if there's a square closer to you that is available, then absolutely go for that one. Or if it's already allocated, as I say, do get in touch and we can sort of have a chat perhaps with those, whoever is allocated to see if they would be happy to join up, share the task, team up and work together. Unfortunately, we cannot create new squares. They are randomly generated, so we can't create new squares. As it were, we do stick to the generated squares. Just to make sure that that's part of the scheme's robust design. But what I would say is each time, I believe it's 75% of existing squares are allocated, we do release a new tranche of squares. So if you really are having difficulty, there is quite likely that more squares are going to be released very soon. So that's something else to bear in mind. Do keep coming back and taking a look. We do have folk that take on squares somewhere perhaps that they tend to holiday, for example, or people can monitor squares every other year. So there's lots of different ways that you can get involved. So as I say, I definitely encourage getting in touch with the support team, and we can kind of work something out that works best for you.
Amazing, great, thank you. So another question on the actual squares. Do you have to find and use the same patches within the 1 kilometre squared as someone has before? Or indeed, is it better to change the areas that you're monitoring to better reflect the square's diversity or the project's priority habitats?
That's a really good question, because our initial answer would always be we want to continue monitoring squares that we already have data, because of course we're super duper interested in change over time. The reason it's a super duper good question, because you sort of intimated there that perhaps the previous plot locations perhaps weren't as reflective of the habitat. That could well, though, be for a number of reasons. It might be due to accessibility, to land access permissions. So there's very likely to be reasons why those plots are placed where they are. And as I say, our priority would always be to maintain monitoring the existing plots. It may even be a case that the habitat's changed since it was first set up. And that does happen now that we have been running for a longer period of time. Some people say, well, do you know what, my one plot has changed from one habitat type to another as a result of the management. Should I still carry on surveying it? Absolutely, because that's ultimately what we're interested in, what the impact that management change has had, what we're seeing within that plot. So yeah, the priority is always to stick to the same plots. You can always add more plots if you feel like, actually, I can gain access, I feel really happy, this additional plot would really add value. It's representative of the square. You can have more than 5 plots. You can add additional plots.
Nice, cool, thank you. That links really nicely to the next question, which has come up from a few people. It's about land access. Who liaises with landowners regarding land access? Have there been any issues with this? Are you able to provide support with this?
Right, lots of questions. Yes. So the short answer really is that it is the volunteers that make, in a lot of cases, in most cases, make that approach and requests land access permissions. That's simply because we have over 2,500 squares nationwide, so it's really hard for us to manage sort of a database of landowners, particularly because it's quite a dynamic thing. You know, people sell land or buy land quite regularly. There are certain sort of larger scale landholders that we do have our contacts within. So, for example, I've already mentioned National Trust, even MOD, Wildlife Trust. You know, there are lots of larger scale landowners that we do have contacts with, so we're more than happy to help. But we do provide support on this front. So we provide tips, guidance on how to find and how to approach landholders. We provide a letter that's from us, so you basically fill in the blanks with sort of your name and your information, so that it completely explains the scheme, what will be done with the data, how it's used, so you have that. And of course, we are always here to answer any questions from landowners. So if they're concerned about how data will be used or what that will mean, or even golly, right up to things like, I'm trying to think now, insurance, or health and safety, we are here. We do have ways that we can help and we can support. It's just a case of the volunteer making that first contact and finding out. But having said that, if you're really struggling to find out who the landowner is, we always say to do contact us, and we'd much rather help than having somebody give up because they can't find the landowner. For example, in terms of difficulty, by and large, people are really curious to know what we're finding on their land. We certainly, for the most part, landowners are happy, interested. Of course, we're not necessarily monitoring or recording unless you're conducting an inventory survey. Super rare, species that's going to flag up an awful lot of interest, or a requirement to change management type. We're recording quite common, widespread species, but are still really useful to understand how healthy that habitat is. So more often than not, our landowners actually say, yeah, that's great, but can I get a copy of what you're recording? And of course they can, it's their land. So we're always more than happy to share the data with the landowners. And actually it's been really nice, as I say, 10 years on, some landowners going, well, do you know what? They told us that. So I've done X, Y, and Z, and I'm seeing, more of something else or less of something else. So as I say, by and large, super happy. If anybody has said no, it's usually more to do with safety, in which case, brilliant, let us know, and we might need to remove that square. We wouldn't want any volunteers to be putting themselves at risk, but of course these squares are randomly generated, so occasionally something might pop up, and a landowner might say you don't want to be going there because there's the terrain's very difficult, or it's very close to a cliff, or perhaps there's ground nesting breeding birds we don't want you to access. That's absolutely fine. It's usually for reasons like that, really.
Super. Did you have time for any more questions, or if people have more questions, should they contact you via email? Did you got time for?
So I'm going to go back actually so that you've got that email address. If you email support@npms.org.uk, as I say, we can answer emails by, questions by email, or if you'd have a preference to, even arrange a phone call and we can chat about what's in your local area. Perhaps there's a local recording group that might be interested to take on some squares. Can we help facilitate that? Then do just get in touch. We are always happy to chat with anybody interested in taking on a square.
Super. Yeah, there's a couple more questions, but I think they're more ones that might need that support of like looking at where those local squares are and seeing who can if they can like take on a local square. Sorry if I have missed any. I think I got to all the other questions. But yeah, do feel free to email.
That's right. The only other thing that I would say is as well something that of course it's a self-led activity, but we are finding that more and more volunteers are sort of teaming up, whether it's to share car journeys, or somebody wants to learn from someone else in terms of the botanical ID, and sort of in return they enter the data. So yeah, there's lots of different ways in which people can get involved. So certainly do get in touch, and we can see what how we can help.
Amazing, thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to finish up really by saying a massive thank you for sharing all of that today, and thanking everyone as well for your questions and participation. I have just dropped a link to a feedback survey. If you do have a couple of minutes, there is a potential £50 prize draw to win to spend on wildlife surveying equipment. So if you have a couple of minutes, please do answer that. It's really helpful. Yeah, and other than that, thank you very much for coming along this evening, and we really look forward to you taking part in this survey. Thank you.
Hopefully brilliant. Thank you so much. I hope to hear from you soon.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Lars. Bye.